Okay, good afternoon. So I'm going to be talking through 5 things to optimising Google Tag Manager. I'm slightly nervous to ask who actually uses Google Tag Manager data. Oh, yes. Good. So I've worked in SEO and analytics for the last 15 odd years. I've worked in B2B, B2C, and over the last year in charity clients. So yes, Torchbox, we're the leading digital marketing agency for charities and not-for-profits. Personally, I found that massively rewarding over the last year. But yeah, different to what I thought it would be like. So we're going to be covering, firstly, I just thought I'd do a sense check. I'll just make sure we're all talking about the same thing when we talk about Google Tag Manager. Then I'm going to quickly go into why it can cause problems. And then finally, practical things we can do to make it work better. And that's both from a management perspective in terms of having lots of people coming into the container and also from a site performance perspective as well. So firstly, Google Tag Manager. It's a free tool and it allows you to store, manage marketing tags without modifying website code. And that's huge because before Google Tag Manager, essentially, if we wanted anything to work on the site, we would have to get into a dev queue and ask them to do it. So yeah, massively useful. So okay, why it can cause problems. Chances are there is an analytics team, an analytics person. There is somebody responsible for the analytics. So they're going into the container, they're adding loads of tags, they're doing all that kind of stuff. You've got a marketing team who is asking you to add tags in there as well. They're looking to kind of get particular conversions set up. And you've also got a web team who's likely to be doing data layer stuff and adding in specific events to track stuff on the website. The problem is, as analysts, we tend to be moving forward. We all work really quickly, and there's not really a lot of space for looking backwards. And that allows analytics cruft to appear in the container. So Google Tag Manager ends up being outside of people's remits. So as an analytics agency, are you responsible for kind of what's in there? Is it the marketing team? Is it the web team? The problem is that there is a performance impact from running Google Tag Manager. And that performance impact is not normally seen within the context of a development queue. So there might have been loads and loads of tests prior to a site going live. As soon as it's gone live, it's kind of on its own. And you can put anything you like in Google Tag Manager, and that can have a massive impact. So is it important? So this is a really great case study that, from a client that we worked on end of last year. So the container had 100 tags. It was 91% full. Google doesn't even tell you how big your container is until it's really, really big. And the page speed for that website was generally over 4 seconds. So it's okay, but it's not great. So what the team did is they reduced that down to 20 tags through using lookups and consolidating a lot of stuff that was in there. That brought it down to 30% full. So a good one to note is that if you've got a lot of tags and a lot of variables, a lot of tags, a lot of triggers, and they're roughly the same, it implies you've literally got 1 trigger per tag. That's really ineffective. And look at that. The actual page speed went down by 2 seconds because of that work. The interesting thing for me is that that last bit isn't why the client asked us to do it. They asked us to do it because nobody internally was confident to go into that container because they literally didn't know what they were going to break. So yes, there you go. So 5 things we can optimize. I kind of shot myself in the foot. I should maybe have said 3, but here we go, we've got 5. So we're going to go through tags and triggers, custom HTML and JavaScript, social pixels, enhanced measurement, and lastly, but not least, measurement planning. So, okay, tags and triggers. So UA's been depreciated. So I think later in the year, they're likely to delete a lot of the data, which is why we're obviously looking to get it out of GA and kind of back into something like either Google Sheets or BigQuery. It also means that for a lot of sites, we've been running dual tags for quite a while. That's been adding more weight. So unless someone's actually managing that container, who is it that's gone in and actually removed all of those UA tags because they're all in there and they're all adding weight. So when we're looking at tags and triggers, we're really looking to simplify. We are looking to go through, check everything's working, and then remove anything we can to make the container as small as possible. Okay, site migrations and site updates. I think it's our job as analysts to advocate for the tracking when a site goes live. I've got loads of examples from my own experience of where a site migration has broken things. And if no one is in there actually saying, well, okay, so how is the CSS changing? My favorite example, about 3 weeks ago, I was doing an audit. I noticed one of the big CTAs on the site wasn't working and hadn't worked for 5 months, which was when the site had been moved. And it was literally a site redesign. It wasn't a platform, you know, in terms of like the red boxes of SEO, in terms of how much danger there is in the migration, it was fairly low. There wasn't a lot in there. The problem is the donate button right at the top, big red button, hadn't visually, no difference. The CSS had changed from big red button to big button. The trigger was set up on big red button, which meant that it broke. From a website perspective, you literally wouldn't notice. From a reporting perspective, obviously no one was particularly looking at that, but when I went back to them and said, I've just taken all your event data for the last year, I've got 7 events which stopped working in May, what happened? And they were like, yes, well, that's when our site was migrated. So as analysts, we should be looking to advocate for tracking to make sure it's in people's development queues, particularly when there's things like complex data layers, which are kind of pushing stuff in, because otherwise it will fall outside of them. So running old tags adds weight. So it's definitely the case. In the same way that site speed optimization was literally a kind of, you can have whatever you want because it can do whatever. And it got to the stage of saying, well, actually, you can have 3 images on the page. If we add 5, it adds more weight. You can have 2 fonts, not 3. So people were making those kind of decisions in order to make sure that the performance budget was being met. GTM is outside of all of that. So we really need to simplify and make sure that it's all working. Harder to manage. It's a really big one. If you've got a team internally, you've got a lot of tacit knowledge, but if those people move on, how good is the documentation? So if someone has to go into a complex GTM setup, how confident are you that they can make their way through it? Again, I was doing an audit recently. It took me 40 minutes to go through from a tag to the triggers through to the variables in order to work out exactly how that data was being pulled through. So, yeah. Right, custom HTML and JavaScript. So firstly, it's amazing for extending functionality quite quickly. A great example is I had a call-out box where the call to action was register your interest across all 9 of them. But the H2 contained what they were actually registering their interest for. Using custom JavaScript, I can actually add that as a variable and then add it into the tag. So suddenly that information is much more valuable. It does make it potentially much more complex to manage. And there's definitely a caveat that it can break things as well. So what should be server-side? So it's very easy to kind of go, oh, devs, what a nightmare. It's going to take us 6 months to get this implemented. I can do it quickly on the site. But actually, there is a difference in the data collection between it being server-side, which is going to be much more robust, and being in the browser, which is more likely to break. So, for example, if you've got an e-commerce donation kind of process where you've got a mix of kind of on-page and server-side data layer pushes, you're going to start seeing inconsistencies in that data. So just because you can put something in Google Tag Manager and it's easier and it potentially gets around the internal politics of trying to get something pushed up a dev queue doesn't mean you should do it. My own example of this, and I'm only sharing it in terms of never ever do this, was I was brought into a site migration really late, and it meant that because the HTML on all of the donation process, or it was an auction house, the e-commerce process was being changed. All the HTML was changing, which meant that every single data layer would break. So foolishly and naively, I had a piece of JavaScript written which would basically act as a stopgap so that before the data layer could be put in properly, it would still work. And the reason I say it was foolish is that it was an enterprise level site. I put that code live at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. I checked it at 9:15, and over 1 million had been taken through that conversion process. A couple of months later, I think it was still running. And because they changed the layout of the page, it wasn't showing the right data anyway. So definitely don't do it. Right, so takeaways from custom HTML, JavaScript. It does extend functionality, but it can be very hard for new starters to get up to speed, which can lead to paralysis in managing the tracking. And again, my own favorite, we've got a couple of examples of this where on test sites, we've put HTML in, which has crashed the website. And it's really difficult to find. Sometimes it creates a loop, and it can take 20 or 30 minutes for the website to crash. So Google Tag Manager can be really dangerous. So you have to make sure that the HTML you're putting in there is really robust. I still remember the horror of the face of a senior dev who realized just how powerful. He was like, you can literally inject whatever you like into the page. And it was like, yes, I can. So the third thing we're going to talk about is social pixels. And the reason for that is I still see a lot of agencies sending actual HTML scripts rather than just the bits of code we need to add a template. The benefit of using a template is that if it gets updated, it's automatically updated within the container, so you're not left with an older piece of technology. So it's easier to manage, and it works better. The second thing is lookups versus multiple tags. Again, this is the thing. I asked the team, have you got examples of where you've seen this? And we had donation journeys where every single page had a different trigger and a different tag, when actually using lookups, you can have one trigger, one tag, and the variable looking at the page name. So you go from having 6 or 7 different tags to having one. So again, the work we did earlier was particularly around Facebook pixels. So there were 10 or 12 being fired on different conversion points all over the site. All of those were drawn into one tag, which we're then looking at the variable to set it. So it's a really, really powerful thing to do, and it makes it much, much easier to manage. So it's definitely worth looking at how many pixels are live. I was talking to a client in the week, and we stripped out something like 10 to 12 tags because they were on platforms which they weren't using anymore. So we stripped out TikTok and we stripped out Nextdoor, I think it was. But it's just a really good example of people put these tags in there and then nobody is responsible for taking them back out again. So it's worth having a spreadsheet saying, what's the social tag? When was it added? When does the campaign finish? What do we need to turn off? So this one is very particularly for charity clients. And that is, there were some Guardian articles earlier in the year where they really kind of like named and shamed some quite big charities and the Metropolitan Police for basically giving Facebook information which it shouldn't necessarily have access to. So for example, on the Met, they had an application form to become a police officer. So you could click on the button, great. The problem is, it was a site-wide pixel. So if you were going on there to report something else, Facebook would know about it. And that's not necessarily a good thing. So one of the things we do is a sensitive content audit, and we just check to make sure that actually, is it justifiable and correct that all of those pixels are firing on every single page? And obviously, we exclude the ones where they shouldn't be. So again, I've said this a couple of times, but having more pixels means it's harder to manage. So is that campaign still live? Does it need to be there? All of this affects site speed. So it's definitely worth taking a look at. And sensitive content led to articles in The Guardian, which was really bad. So, okay, enhanced measurement. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because I've got 2 more points to do. So enhanced measurement is, you can turn it on by default, and that's great. The problem is scroll depth is set at 90%. So if you've got very short content or very long content, it doesn't care. It's just going to set it at 90. So if you want a more nuanced view of that, you need to set up a pixel to track how long the content is and exclude short form content. The second one is form completions. So again, enhanced measurement, there's not a lot of kind of authentication on there. So it can be firing, and actually that isn't something which should go through. So form completions is something that's definitely worth looking at. And site search needs to have specific parameters within it. If your site doesn't, then it will fall outside of this. But because you've ticked the button, you might be thinking it's working. So check what you have running. Implement forms and scroll tracking through GTM directly, and you'll definitely get some better data collection. So everything I've talked about so far has been about auditing and fixing what's actually there at the moment. And that's great, because it gives us a clean container which is doing what it should do. I think one of the most important things that we can look at is the measurement plan. And that's because data tells a story, and analytics data is trend data. It's not hard data in the way that your CRM system is likely to be. Things like cookie consent have reduced the amount of recorded traffic on sites really significantly. So it leaves us with less data. So what are we going to do with it? To my mind, the digital strategy has to feed into a measurement plan. We've got so much data across the website already that actually, if we start thinking about that in terms of what do we actually want to record, what is it we're trying to do? So that means that we can start looking at whether we're tracking the right metrics. So what we really want to do is go from the digital strategy. We want to put that down into objectives. So, for example, one of the things we get in charities a lot is that we've got information pages, we've got fundraising pages, we've got donation pages. And actually the user journeys across those and what we want people to do is really different. So it's worth actually splitting those out. That means that we've got KPIs and dashboards which actually allow us to start saying, well, this was our objective. What are we doing against it? And so for me, that really brings us into this CRO kind of campaign kind of footing. And that's really where we want to be. We want to have good, accurate data collection, and then we want to go, well, okay, so here's some numbers on the website. How do we want to affect those? Do we want it to go up? Do we want it to go down? What are we doing to change those numbers? So the biggest thing here is, can you articulate the digital strategy? If you sit down with the team and they're not sure, then actually you need to go back and get them to be able to articulate it. You can start talking about personas, you can start talking about user journeys, but they should be able to articulate it. And finally, that means that we can kind of make sure they're actually going in the right direction. What I love about CRO is that 80% of what you do is likely to fail. And you can tell the client that up front. And it's brilliant. I've been on way too many calls where as agencies, we've said, fix these 5 things and your form is going to be amazing. So they do it, and it doesn't work. And they're like, you guys are idiots. You don't know what you're talking about. So, right. Lastly, I've got a minute left. So do these things. Audit the tags and triggers and simplify the container. We really want it to be as small as possible. Plan for site migrations and site upgrades, because if you don't, your tracking will break. Another good example, download functionality completely changed between a site redesign, and because of that, all of the downloads tracking failed. So if you're not there for site migrations, then that's the kind of stuff that's going to happen. And finally, use a measurement plan, because that's how we really can get great value out of our trend data. So we can move away from kind of going, well, okay, so maybe the data's not perfect, by kind of explaining that it's not a hard data source anyway, and what we want to do is move that number one way or another. So thank you very much. I've got a thingy. So yeah, great. Thank you.